just start going live in 2-3 minutes, and Deepak will put it up. I'll go offline, and Sheila and you can continue after.
Perfect. Perfect. Thank you.
And sorry for the delay. Like we were just trying to figure things out. Yeah.
No problem. Don't worry at all.
All right. Bye-bye.
Hey, Srila, can you hear me? Srila, can you speak? I think she has a problem making with the... Okay. Do you hear me okay? Yes, yes. Okay. Right now, it says that the host has disabled screen share. For you? Yeah, I was just seeing if I could do it. Maybe you want to enable that before.
Now, can you see it?
Yeah, now I can do it. Thanks.
Hi everyone, welcome to the ninth lecture of Mindsperm uh, on COVID-19 and manufacturing sector by Anant Ahuja. So sorry for the delay due to some technical issues. We couldn't send the YouTube streaming link on the time. That's why there is a delay of 20 minutes. We apologize for that. So yeah, Anant, it's all yours now. Sorry for keeping you waiting.
Cool. Thank you. So good evening, everybody. Thank you guys all for joining. Thank you to Mindsperm for creating this platform and having us on. My name's Anant, and I'm here representing Good Business Lab. So in today's talk, I will tell you guys a little bit about what Good Business Lab does, and we'll address the topic of the impact of COVID on the manufacturing sector, with emphasis on the garment manufacturing business. If you give me a second, I'll just share my screen. Okay. Cool. So I've outlined the talk to follow these points. First, I'll just tell you guys a little bit about what Good Business Lab really is and what we do. Then I'll share some information on the garment industry specifically, some background information that will help you understand the context of this conversation. Then I'll look at some ways in which we're seeing COVID-19's impact on the industry. And GBL's response to this was, one of our responses was to do a workshop in which we came up with some ideas and guidelines for our industry partner, Shahi Exports, to follow for reopening their factories. So I'll talk you through a little bit, the guidelines a little bit and how the implementation is going so far. And then hopefully at the end, we'll have some time for a Q&A. Cool. So just an intro on GBL, some basic stuff that I wanted to share with you guys. But there's this basic idea we believe, which is that businesses take care of business well. They focus on their profits and ensuring that they maximize those profits. But spending on worker well-being is usually just considered philanthropy or compliance. It's not part of the core business strategy for most companies. And an effect of that is that worker well-being programs don't get scaled up and we don't actually recognize their full business potential. In low skill manufacturing industries, like the garment industry, which employs millions of people worldwide, productivity, wages, and worker retention are extremely low. So these are issues that affect both the firm and the worker. And by addressing these common interests, GBL's mission is to lead businesses to invest in the well-being of all workers. So just to summarize, we are a not-for-profit labor innovation lab. We do research to evaluate the holistic impact of worker well-being programs. And what that looks like is randomized controlled trials, which, the results of which we write papers about and submit to peer-reviewed journals. The other two co-founders of Good Business Lab are both professors, Ach Advaryu and Anant Naishadam. They're professors at the University of Michigan, development economists. And so there is this strong sort of academic approach to our work, but our work also goes beyond research and academics. So the entire cycle of how we work, it starts by identifying worker needs, then we design solutions, worker or firm needs, then we design solutions, and we test for well-being impacts and financial returns of these solutions, and then we try to drive the adoption of these proven solutions. So using my knowledge and experience from working with the garment manufacturing sector, I hope to share some of the on-ground challenges brought on or exposed by the pandemic, and then also the solutions that we're currently testing. Just going to pause there for 1 sec, make sure everything's good. Okay. Thanks again, everyone, for tuning in. I know we have a lot of folks from GBL, from Shahi as well. All right. Okay. So I'll talk specifically about the garment industry, give you guys some background, but one key fact to keep in mind is that this is like a highly integrated global supply chain. So the COVID-19 is affecting all businesses, and we're seeing, we're seeing how that's happening. All sectors are being affected, but in some sense, fashion and the garment manufacturing business is particularly vulnerable. So this information is taken from a McKinsey study, a McKinsey report, which predicts a huge decline in this sector in the coming months. And I think one key factor of manufacturing in general, and also of this business, is how labor intensive it is, and the fact that you cannot work from home if you work in a factory. So the way that this business runs is basically you have brands and retailers, companies that a lot of you would have heard about. Maybe some of you guys are wearing clothes from these brands and retailers that that we've interacted with and worked with, but they generally have sourcing destinations across the world, and that's what I mean to say when it's an integrated global supply chain. So you can have your fabric coming from one part of the world, then you can have the cutting, sewing, finishing happening in a different part, and then the actual retail somewhere else. So because of the way that works and because of the labor intensity, common sourcing destinations tend to be here in Asia. And China is the largest garment manufacturing country in terms of export, followed by Bangladesh, Vietnam, and then India. So just to give you guys a sense of how labor intensive this business is, our industry partner, Shahi Exports, is a large garment manufacturing firm based here in India. They have about 65 factories across the country in 9 states, and there's a workforce of about 120,000 full-time workers. So for the same investment, Shahi Exports creates 250 times the jobs that Reliance does. So that's just to compare garment manufacturing to the IT sector. And then when we look at the sort of demographic of the workforce, garment manufacturing mostly employs low-income, unskilled workers who earn minimum wages. So when you consider all this context, it really sets the stage for a lot of challenging issues, which we're seeing now and we're going to continue to see. Here's some more insights from a McKinsey study on the fashion industry and how it's hit by the consequences of COVID-19. So on the left, we see the demand forces, and then on the right, the supply. The demand forces are more from the brand and retail side, directly from consumers. We're not seeing, obviously, with people on lockdown and quarantine and shelter and home orders in place, people aren't able to visit stores. Stores remain closed. In addition to that, consumer sentiment has changed. People are not indulging in buying as much. And if they are, usually, or probably the only way they can do it is online shopping. So traditional channels aren't really working right now, temporarily at least. And then on the supply side, what that's causing is huge inventory problems. So clothes that have already been made or are currently being made, or even the future orders, brands and retailers aren't sure how they will be able to sell them. So they're predicting huge discounts. Supply chains are disrupted. As I was saying, it's very interconnected supply chain. So if there's an issue or a lockdown in one part of the world, it can affect the entire value chain. And then perhaps the worst impact of all is what's happening in terms of labor, the labor crisis. So we're still seeing this happen. If we consider impact in general, it's hard to know the impact of something as you continue to experience it. We've seen some of the terrible impacts of the virus itself on people's health, but unfortunately, it seems like there will be a lot of economic impacts and future impacts we're also going to have to deal with. So yeah, this talk, I think it's an attempt to sort of give you a macro view, talk about some of the current impacts we are seeing on the industry and the workforce. And I would also say that the GBL team, along with some of our partners, are still running studies, collecting data to assess the impacts of the crisis on individual workers, which I'll share some early insights that we have on towards the end of this discussion. Okay, so now let's look specifically at what's going on here in India. So as we all know, India went into a national lockdown on March 23rd. We're still in some version of the lockdown, but now factories have slowly been allowed to reopen, starting from last week and earlier. Obviously, there's tons of safety guidelines they're forced to follow. And the past few weeks have been quite intense because when the lockdown was first announced, India was one of the earlier countries to go into lockdown, but across the globe, the pandemic had started affecting, different countries. So a lot of countries where our industry partner Shahi exports to, those markets had already been affected and were starting to react to the impacts of the crisis. So what happened was the initial impulse or initial reaction of a lot of brands and retailers was to just cancel orders, even for finished goods. So the summer goods that Shahi's factories were working on and all the other factories across the world were working on for the large part were starting to get canceled. And this really alarmed the entire global community and people who knew about this, because an impulsive reaction like that would have huge adverse impacts on the supply chain and the supply chain workers. And the reason that is, the immediate concern for a business like Shahi is the wage bill that they have to pay. So in manufacturing, when it's a labor intensive sort of business, wage becomes a huge component of your overall cost. In the garment industry in particular, I think it's one of the highest. It's about 30%. So 30% of the business cost is just wages. And now, without the ability to run the factories, without the ability to work from home, all operations stopped. So there's literally no source of revenue and a huge wage bill that a garment manufacturing firm would have to take care of. So the issues that this exposed were the way that I guess you could say the buying terms that exist between manufacturing firms and brands and retailers, because essentially, sorry, I'm just going to stop. Yeah, essentially what happens is garment manufacturing firms tend to work on credit. So brands and retailers will place an order, and then a firm will procure all the raw materials, pay the labor and get the work done, and then ship out the goods, and then sometime later receive the payment. So what this meant is tons of goods had been made already and some were already shipped, but the payments hadn't been received, and those payments were needed in order to pay for future wages and other costs. So that is what really, I think, the immediate concern for people in this business were, employers. And I think the other challenge was that the payment terms essentially left manufacturing firms financially exposed because of all the investments they would have made. So then, these conversations between manufacturing firms and brands and retailers happened, and basically the message that firms like Shahi were telling their customers was that, look, we have these huge wage bills. There will be huge humanitarian impacts if we don't get paid. And I think the ask initially was quite simple. It was to say, these are the goods we've shipped, and we need payments for these goods. But I think slowly brands started to understand the issues, and I think a few brands really led the way and made commitments to make these payments. Now we're seeing a lot of brands moving in that direction, although they, as I mentioned earlier, they're also affected because of the rent they pay for stores, no footfall in their stores, no one shopping. So they do have these challenges as well. But as much as they need to cut costs and protect their business, the real risk for millions of people, for humanity, is on the supply chain and the workers who rely on these wages to really get by. So the conversation started to change once the global community became aware of this issue and the fact that a lot of cancellations were happening. And eventually, the employers here in India and across the world where manufacturing exists were talking to governments to understand what support they could get. And I think one really important distinction to kind of be aware of is if you look at countries like the US or a lot of European countries, governments had stepped in and really said, look, here's the social protections that we can offer. Many firms were furloughing their employees. So that was basically putting a pause on their contract, and the government was compensating these people so the wage bill could go down. But in India, there was no option to do that. So basically, the government asked employers not to lay off any workers and continue to pay full wages. So this meant that firms like Shahi had to pay full wages for March and April when the whole time factories remained closed and couldn't produce any goods. So I think what this revealed and sort of emphasized was the fact that the limited systems of sort of social security measures that exist here, in other countries that manufacture garments, we look at Bangladesh, for example, it's a huge part of their economy. And over there, the government basically approved a law to pay for that employers would have to pay 60% of wages, with the idea being that the remaining 40% would be covered by the government or through soft loans. So again, I think without some kind of support, like we've seen firms in the US get through furloughs, or even in Europe where unemployment benefits and other types of employee support exists. Here in India, there wasn't much of this going on. So garment manufacturing firms, employers were really worried about what would happen, and at the same time trying to talk to their customers to basically figure out how to restore orders and ensure business could continue once the lockdown was lifted. So basically, the way this was done from an employer perspective was that the dialogue and engagement that happened between manufacturers and their customers has eventually led to better decisions, I would say. And the request, that firms like Shahi were making to customers was to pay for the goods that had been shipped or completed and honor their commitments. And I think we saw, a big shift in how brands were thinking about this because of the effects on the supply chain as they realized. And I think also because of the importance of the survival of the entire supply chain. I think in order to have a future sustainable garment industry, obviously the survival of all your suppliers is also extremely important. So from Shahi's perspective, as I mentioned, Good Business Lab is was incubated at Shahi and is a close partner. A lot of GBL's research happens at Shahi. Most of our work happens there. So the insights that we have are basically that a lot of Shahi's customers do intend to build on a sort of strategic partnership with a firm like Shahi, because I think being a firm that is able to do advanced manufacturing and also has years of experience and works closely with their key customers, this has allowed a level of trust to exist. But I think this consolidation of that we're going to see now from brands and retailers in terms of their suppliers, I think for some firms it will be great, and it can mean more business, but it can also have a lot of negative impacts. And I think that's why it's quite important that brands and retailers do have dialogue and engage with their vendors, with their suppliers, and do it do this so that they can have a responsible exit strategy if that's what they plan to do. In addition to that, there are international sort of movements around this topic. So the ILO has actually created a call to action for the garment industry specifically. And the call to action basically aims to generate collaboration across the garment industry to protect workers' income, their health, their employment, to support employers, obviously, to survive through this crisis and work together to kind of create a more sustainable future. So Shahi has actually become the first manufacturer to endorse this ILO call to action. But I think these are the types of things that can allow the proper dialogue and proper strategy to really be able to come out of this crisis, more smoothly. So that I guess is the high level situation. And we're using this example of Shahi because it really is GBL's closest partner and has been from the start. Shahi's factories are essentially testing ground for GBL to run a bunch of these research projects, which we do. But in this case, normally we do randomized control trials. We do all types of research experiments. But in this case, there was unique problems that were happening and also not much time to respond. So once once the world understood more about what was going on with this lockdown, and there was some comfort for employers to know that their orders were restored and they would actually be paid for their past goods, then the focus became, how do we safely reopen our factories? Because social distancing in a garment manufacturing firm, perhaps in any manufacturing firm, is not really an easy thing to do. Firms that have 2,000, 3,000 workers on the shop floor, on the production floor, they're not used to maintaining this type of distance. And I think there was a lot of challenges to think about once we got past this issue of orders and sort of this whole, impulsive reaction that we saw initially. So the way that we responded to this as GBL was we basically put together a team internally and got some outside help. And we ran a workshop to essentially do some research and find safety kind of guidelines that existed, then sort of contextualize these norms to Shahi's factories, and then apply a sort of design thinking perspective to create practical solutions that could really, ensure the safety of workers. So 1 second. We'll go back to the presentation. So these were some of the key questions we were trying to answer from this workshop that was conducted earlier in April. Once, as I mentioned, once orders had been restored, once there was a sense that there is business to do, there is work to do in these factories, now we just need to get them open. That became Shahi's mentality. And so we were trying to understand these things. What steps can factories take to really ensure workers aren't anxious to come to work? How can factories run, keeping everyone's safety in mind? Obviously, what is a contingency plan if a worker has symptoms, or how can factories ensure this sort of, the right handling of these situations? And then how do we prevent anxieties from really disrupting the entire system? So this became the basis of the workshop that GBL did. And I think what it involved was talking to a lot of people on the ground, people with a lot of experience. So I know some folks from Shahi are tuned in and have contributed a lot to this work. So we definitely appreciate that. And I think a lot of hard work is still being put into maintaining these guidelines. But here's some information on the guidelines specifically. So first of all, I'll just say these guidelines are available online on the GBL website. And we're actually working on further developing them, making them available through a sort of pop-up site for, not just for the garment manufacturing business, but for other sort of labor-intensive sectors. But right now, I'll just kind of give you some framework, the framework we followed, and some understanding around how we approach this problem. So we basically looked at two types of workers in the factories: the local daily commuters, and then the migrant workers from different states that were working, that had migrated from, say, Orissa to Bangalore, and were now living there, but working at the factories. So among these two groups, there were some workers that couldn't come back to work once the lockdown was lifted, either due to health reasons. If they had any symptoms, they were told not to come, obviously, or if they had left the city in which their factory was, then borders were sealed. So that also was a barrier to their rejoining the workforce. But then there were some available healthy workers who didn't have symptoms and were ready to work. And for those people specifically, we thought about what should the process be, what should day one look like, or day zero, we called it actually, because when Shahi's factories did open, the idea was to say, there's still some time, we know when this is going to happen, so let's do some pre-work. And one of the main things that was done at first was involved a lot of communication, reaching out to workers, finding out people's situations. And then an important step that the team did was to actually conduct like a medical declaration conversation, sort of. So to ask workers how they're feeling, where they've been the last 14 days, if they have any symptoms. Also to ensure them that, look, if you do have symptoms and can't attend, we'd prefer that. We're not going to cut your pay, this, that. So really ensuring the safety of their livelihood, but also the safety of the factory, so that no one who is infected or has symptoms comes to work. So once the medical declaration was done, then you have the first day of work where everyone comes in, and really that was, although it was day one in terms of the start of work, most of the time was spent towards awareness. Again, medical declarations for those who had it, who it couldn't have been done for, and just learning the concepts of distancing, safety norms. Again, focusing a lot on communication and so on. So this was the approach, and I think it's been going for about 2 weeks, and some factories are able to most factories have been able to smoothly apply these guidelines. I'll show you guys some photos. This is what it looks like in some of Shahi's units in Karnataka. So we're seeing social distancing as people enter. There's obviously temperature checks, social distancing in the production lines. And I think this is, this is really like emphasizing I guess you could say, the common interest that exists now that have always existed, as GBL believes, between firms and workers, but it's really highlighted now because if there is an infection or a spread of the infection in the factory, obviously that's going to stop the factory from being able to work. So now that threat is a very real threat. That's I think all firms are realizing, and it's forcing them to sort of invest more in the health and well-being of their workforce. So I think this is just a really high-level overview, but like I said, you can read the guidelines, share your thoughts. We're obviously continuing to develop these guidelines as we get more insight from the Shahi team. And I think there's still a long way to go here. There's some pretty sort of out-of-the-box strategies that are being discussed as well. Layout transformation, creating sort of a social connect, although a physical disconnect, investing more in medical teams and medical infrastructure. So these are all the types of ways in which I think firms are going to have to start thinking about how to sustainably run labor intensive kind of workplaces. So I'll just pause there for a second. If there's some questions.
Yes, so Anant, Ayush here.
Yeah.
And yeah, really interesting insights that we saw coming in from what Shahi is doing and how the labor research is going on at Good Business Labs. Again, we saw the images of the women following social distancing. But do you think, given the current times, or how with such a pandemic and labor being a critical resource being used, do you think there could be a shift towards more automation in the future, and there could be certain fundamental changes in how we look at manufacturing at this point?
Yeah, I mean, I think like the garment manufacturing business, it's ripe for disruption. You know, it depends a lot on manual processes, and I think people have been trying for a long time to automate the process, but realistically, you know, when you look at fashion, it's very different than making cars, for example, because with cars you have a standard sort of model, and then you produce, you know, however many, whatever quantity of that specific model. You don't, you know, have too many changes, maybe some color, some interiors. But when you look at this business, there's different fabrics, there's different fits, there's different sizes, there's so many styles. So even if you do automate a process, what becomes hard to do is create the type of automation that can handle all this variation. So I think this has been a problem a lot of people have been thinking about, but while wages continue to remain low, I think the cost benefit of investing in automation is still, you know, probably being analyzed. I think people are working on it, but I don't think it's gonna, I think the situation may speed up people's interest in it, but in terms of the actual innovation, I mean, I think it's gonna happen for sure, but I'm not sure how soon it will, how soon we'll really see it.
Yeah, definitely. So there could be certain changes that we're looking at, but depending on the size of the industry, the ways of working, there could be certain uh, extent of automation, but again, limited to how much human interaction is possible. And just to get back to the start of the talk, so I think we need to address this with the audience as well. So firstly, apologies for the delay, everyone, and to you, Anant. We saw certain technical issues from Zoom, and we looked at certain articles on the web. So there was a outage on Zoom, but we managed to get back on time. We tried to send the links to the viewers. So welcome everyone, and firstly, thank you all for joining in today. And I think we skipped the most important part, which was to introduce Anant as well. So for those of you who probably don't know, Anant, as he spoke about, is the co-founder at Good Business Labs, which is a labor research and labor innovation startup. So apart from that, he is also a head of organizational development at Shahi Export, which is again India's largest apparel manufacturer, employing over 1 lakh people. So that gives us a sense of what we are talking about in terms of manufacturing and how on ground things are happening. Again, as a graduate of UPenn, he has studied BA in political science, and it's just an absolute honor to have you here and get some insights into how the garment manufacturing is having, and use that as a proxy to understand the issues or certain challenges that the labor might be facing on ground. So as you've rightly covered in the talk, and there could be, if there are some points that are remaining, we could touch upon that. But it was nice to understand how Good Business Lab is actually driving those innovations. I do have a couple of questions in mind that have come in from the participants as well as on the YouTube live. If there are certain things that you would want to cover before we take those questions, then I can leave it up to you, and then we can probably discuss this.
No, why don't we go to the questions, and then you know, I'll address any remaining points towards the end if anything's left.
Sure. So one of the questions that we got from the participants is, amidst the chaos during these unprecedented times, is it still a good time to come out with apparel startups? If yes, what changes can we see in the customer purchase behavior in terms of apparel?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think a lot of people are wondering this. I mean, in some sense, I think, you know, the short-term situation is not good. Of course, we're seeing all these declines in consumer behavior. We're seeing all these economic impacts. People don't want to, spend. They want to save money right now if they have it. But I think clothing is an essential item. I don't see the industry itself going away. And in fact, there's a lot of disruption happening right now in this business. So perhaps it's a good opportunity to enter, bring new approaches. If you have that perspective. Also, I think, starting a new business, if you really take your time and think about how to do it, this is a good time to strategize if you're in the right sort of mentality and frame of mind. So I wouldn't discourage these type of things. I think, it's probably not realistic to launch a business today and expect customers, but if you're thinking in the future, businesses like Shahi are hopeful about the future. And I think even brands, we're starting to see, like, as they, in the next few weeks now, stores will start to open and we'll see how brands are able to do and brands and retailers. I think you're on mute.
Yeah. So yeah, that was a good response to the question. Coming to the actual labor challenges or what they might be facing, do you think at this point, during a pandemic like this, are companies justified to cut down on labor costs, and how do they go around the policy structure of employing certain number of people and maintaining their wages? And at this point, do you think unions actually help businesses, or they actually sort of gang up against big businesses and try to demand their rights when it might not be sustainable for the business itself?
Well, I mean, I think that, now is a time where worker well-being is more important than ever, because we're all suffering through this crisis, but it's obviously affecting some people much more than others. Some people are just seeing the worst of it. So I think it is a responsibility for firms to really protect their workforce. And as we've seen with Shahi, they've really made a commitment to pay the full wages. And I think a lot of their intentions are actually aligned with what unions are saying. And you look at the ILO call to action, which Shahi has endorsed, and it's really the product of conversations and dialogue between unions, between brands. So I think it's a really important time for us, perhaps for everyone, to really come together and figure this out. I mean, the way I see it, Shahi, for example, has a model where they employ their workforce full time. They don't use a lot of contract work. So when we talk about this 1 lakh population, it's all full-time workers. And basically, this crisis in some cases may have revealed the challenges of that model, because it's not easy then to think about how do you, handle wages and how do you do all these things. But at the same time, as Shahi looks towards the future, continuing work, reopening factories, this sort of perspective of really, thinking of the workforce as full-time Shahi sort of family, I think that's been beneficial, because when you need to mobilize them and reopen factories, and obviously they're doing their best they can to make sure safety is followed, but you never really know. Like there's so much unknown for everybody. So the trust that exists between the firm and the workers, these are the situations where that really matters, because ramping up production to be able to go back to producing how much we need to ship out goods, to continue back onto sort of the cycle, that I think is a crucial thing now. And actually, I didn't mention this in the talk, but even during the lockdown, a few of Shahi's factories were actually repurposed to make protective equipment. So they were producing hazmat suits for the government of India through the Ministry of Textiles. And even to do that was, it has its own risks, of course, but the connection and trust between the workers who were asked to come back, that was highly critical at that time. So I personally think, as I said earlier, also like with firms that are thinking long term, that want to survive in the long term, that want to be in this business, I think your workforce is your most important resource. And I think as we see sometimes, when you really create that connection and ensure that you're prioritizing their well-being, then you can actually achieve a lot.
All right. Yeah. So addressing another question that we had received earlier. So this comes from a participant, and this goes: how can the manufacturing sector support small and local artisans in this period? And what can large manufacturing facilities do to support local businesses with a small customer base? So is there a potential to capitalize or invest in smaller businesses in time like this?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, usually large manufacturers work with large brands and retailers. So I think it's a bit tough, but I actually had a slide on this. One sec.
Sure.
Yeah, here we go. So there's an experiment that GBL has been planning for some time. We've done a bit of work on it. We did a pilot, but it's this idea of engaging the female labor supply. So most of the garment industry is run by women. Most of the workers are female, but even that captive audience that is able to come to factories and work in these workplaces is a really small percentage of the overall workforce available. And in India, we're seeing a declining rate of female labor force participation. A lot of that is due to the restrictions on women's mobility, them not being able to actually come to work. So I think when you consider that context, and then you think about how, we talked about this earlier on, but no one has been able to figure out how to work from home in the manufacturing sector, in the garment business, but there are actual ways to do it. So this project is basically looking at how work could be, I guess you could say how work opportunities could be created at the home. So, I guess what this would mean, it would require some creative thinking and obviously some partnership. But if work that factories are doing, if they could find the work that is more suited for the home environment and some way to actually facilitate that process, then perhaps you could engage with smaller communities, workshops, and this could be a whole new employment model for the industry to explore.
Yeah. So another insight or something that was like something I wanted to ask you personally was the idea behind good business labs, and what does labor empowerment or labor enforcing means, and what are some of the projects that you might be leading on in the good business labs?
Yeah, for sure. So we talked about, this one project I mentioned, but a similar project that I've been thinking about, which we haven't actually done yet, but I think this whole situation has made me think about a lot more, is the idea of flexible work arrangements. So usually manufacturing jobs are quite specific on timing. So there's a very strict sort of starting and end time, and it's uniform across the entire business. And it's needed because a lot of it's team production that happens in the garment business, right? So you have an assembly line, and each operator is performing a different function. So the way that the garment gets made is when each person, performs their function, basically performs their operation. But I think if you also consider the context of this industry largely being, having a female workforce, and then you think about how other industries have really overcome the issues women face by providing flexible work arrangements, then you start to wonder, could an industry that really relies on female employment, could an industry like this also find a way to create flexible work arrangement? And could that increase the labor supply, the potential labor supply? So in this project, what we wanted to do was first just try shorter work weeks. So instead of a 6-day week, which we see commonly in this industry, we would do a 5-day week, and you would add 1 hour of production to each day. And the idea being that, you have Saturdays and Sundays off. You lose a few hours of production, I think 3 hours in total, but ultimately, I guess the hypothesis is that by having that extra time off, that workers could really invest in their own well-being, in their family's well-being, and then be more productive at the workplace. So this is really the central theme of our work. How can we find the ways in which business and worker interests intersect? And then how can we sort of test these ideas? And then if we find that something does work, how do we scale it up?
Yeah. So a really interesting thought behind the whole starting off and initiation of Good Business Lab. Do you also think using research or insights from what you're doing in the garment industry, could such reforms be taken and applied to other industries, or is it specific to how the ways of working allow in garment industry?
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, a lot of the research, the way it's done is, it tells you something specific about that case and the way you ran it. But I think our work now is really expanding. We are actually going beyond the garment industry. I think for us, any labor-intensive business is sort of interesting in terms of this research. So as of now, we've actually started doing some work in Latin America, and we're working with some firms over there. One of which is retail, like food retail. So there's a company, Arcos Dorados, which is the McDonald's, basically. It's the largest franchisee of McDonald's in Latin America. And they have, I think, 2,000 stores across the continent. They also have 100,000 workers. And basically, they face a lot of similar issues. There's high rates of attrition. There's sometimes low productivity. And a lot of the workplace outcomes we see here in the garment sector. So again, it becomes a way for us to think about how do we align the incentives so that the firm actually can figure out the right ways to invest in well-being of workers that is also going to give them some business advantages. And I think it's really just optimizing firms from the perspective of the workforce, of labor. So yeah, I think there's huge potential. I mean, even firms that really are known for how they treat their workers, you look at some of these tech firms. Twitter just announced that their employees can work from home forever. I don't know if you saw the headline, but basically they were suggesting that even after things return to normal, they will decide. Basically, I think what they said was they will decide when they open their workplace, but they will let their employees decide when they want to return or if they want to return. So, you see tech firms and firms where you have highly skilled labor, and the companies are investing a lot in their well-being and ensuring that their well taken care of because they're valuable. But I think the idea what we're trying to promote is that that same approach can work in all sectors, even in low wage sectors. It just needs to be done correctly.
Yeah. So what seemed interesting to me particularly was looking at some of the pilots or the test runs that we're doing in, say, through Good Business Labs in the garment industry, and if it could be applied or replicated in other parts of the industries or other sectors. So it could have some learnings for other sectors as well. So
Yeah.
rightly pointed. We also have another question coming in from YouTube live right now. And so this is more of a technical question, and we can see if we have the right answer to it. So what do you think would be the consequences of labor law dilutions by some states in the next 3 years? So we saw UP coming up with certain labor law dilutions to safeguard the businesses as well. So again, linking it back to labor and the business and connecting the both, the benefit of both.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think like where this comes from is this idea that, as I mentioned earlier, we look at China, it's a huge kind of player in the garment manufacturing space. They have the biggest market share, followed by Bangladesh. And then you think about where India is placed. And basically, you could say that when it comes to our size, each state in India is like Bangladesh. We could be doing huge volumes of business. We also have a huge captive sort of labor force. We have a huge textile industry. We're one of the biggest growers of cotton. So literally the entire supply chain exists. All the opportunities exist for the garment sector to be huge in India. But apparently, I guess the premise behind these actions is that there's the labor laws are sort of disincentivizing investment into this business. I mean, I personally think that I don't think it's the labor laws in particular, or at least not the ones that are being changed. I think there's other reasons that investors haven't, this industry hasn't been promoted well. But I think, yeah, I mean, it's really going in the opposite direction to reduce the safeguards around, labor. And I think right now is a time where you need your workforce to be protected and safe more than ever. So I don't really, agree with a lot of what's going on, but I actually think that a lot of this is impulsive reaction, which I think will be slowly, reversed as we did already.
Yeah. And I'll take another question from the YouTube comments.
Mhm.
So this is specifically on your research being done at Good Business Labs, and it talks about if the research also tackles problems after manufacturing, such as role of wholesalers, training of retailers, people involved within the supply chain. So are we upskilling people only in one of the functions, or is the value addition happening across the value chain?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think there's so many challenges just at the garment factory level itself. I didn't even get into a lot of our work and stuff like that because there's so much to talk about. But I think for us, the way we're looking at this is starting at the garment firm, but then also going further down or further across the supply chain, all the way to textile manufacturing, to farmers, cotton farmers, and then back up, I think, in other places. But one of the things that we've really thought about is how do we ensure impact? So obviously, we're a research organization. We like to do evidence-based work. This sort of strong academic focus is especially emphasized by the fact that the other two co-founders are professors, as I mentioned. But what we realize that matters most is impact. So a lot of times research gets done and papers get published, but then the knowledge sort of remains in academic journals. And I think we've really made it our mission to take research beyond just the academic world. And the way we're doing that is, I think, two ways in particular, that I'm not sure if this is exactly answering the question, but just to give you a sense of how, my reaction to this question, the two ways in which we're thinking about impact, which I think, could be taken across the entire sort of supply chain or value chain, is one is communication. So really saying, okay, how do we disseminate this information well? How do we talk about it in a way that's accessible? How do we kind of, make all sorts of people interested in these topics, and remove that kind of barrier that sometimes seems to exist around highly academic work. But then also, how do we turn this knowledge into actual solutions? So whether they're products, tech solutions, business models, which then, hopefully can be generalized. So an example of that, which I think has been highly critical in a time like this, we talked a lot about communication and how important it is to communicate effectively with your workforce, whether it's even just to let them know, hey, the factories are open, hey, be aware of medical issues, or your wages are being paid. But if you don't have symptoms, don't come, you'll still get your wage. All these communications are extremely important. And a lot of times, the garment industry has done this in a very sort of analog way. They haven't really needed to go digital until now. So a lot of our projects were actually affected by COVID. We couldn't do as much field work, but one project that really wasn't was a tool that we're rolling out that's essentially a worker voice platform. So it's a two-way communication platform between managers or firms and workers. It's anonymous, and it allows workers to really send in either text or call in and leave a voice message for any questions, grievances, anything. And then, there's case managers at the factory that are meant to respond to these. So a tool like this, I could imagine, could be taken to a lot of different sectors, even within this value chain, the garment value chain.
Yeah, absolutely. So, that's really, really interesting insights from the discussion. And again, from a personal anecdote, and we had this discussion as well. So, having currently working for a garment manufacturer, a fabric manufacturer, as in my own personal job, and we see certain issues coming up with manning norms and production lines, and also the disconnect between the corporate and the factory itself. So, in that regard, do we anticipate any, like we spoke about Twitter networking worksheets? So, in our anticipate a bit of work from home, and do we anticipate any disconnect between, say, the corporate and the production line even further? And do we look for the manning norms at this point and connecting it back to a reduced workforce, or starting at from a lower base? Do we see or anticipate such changes?
I mean, I think as an industry, when the demand for production goes down, then firms will definitely respond. I think fortunately for Shahi, they're seeing enough demand to keep their factories full and running. So that's a really good sign. Obviously, it's in their interest to maintain all this production to make up for losses as much as possible. And they still have a growth mindset, so they plan to continue adding factories. But then I think on the corporate level, yeah, I mean, Shahi has a sort of culture where corporate and like workers and staff, or the two sort of categories, all exist within the same workplace. So you don't have separate corporate offices. I think, it's been a good way for everyone to remain grounded, but it's not clear, what the best strategies are for the future or for the workplace at a corporate staff level, what this means. In some sense, I guess it has forced firms that were more traditional, that were more reliant on in-person interactions, to figure out how to become digital. And, hopefully that thinking can also lead to innovative digital approaches in the factory as well. I think, until now, it will still take some time. So that's why there's this huge focus on really ensuring the safety of the factories. But I think there's, quite possibly a lot of innovation coming out of this crisis. And I think, there's been so many negative effects of the crisis, but hopefully culturally there will be some positive changes in the way people think about work and how they relate to their workforce.
Yeah. So Anant, I think we've got a really interesting question coming in from the Instagram live,
Sure.
and I'd like to know your thoughts on that. So, do you think reverse migrants should stay back in their native places and get involved with agricultural activities or other local activities? If so, what will be the scenario of manufacturing sector in general? And is this some sort of a possibility that we could be looking at in the near future?
Yeah, it's a tough question. I don't really know the response to this. I mean, I had a few slides actually on the migrant situation at Shahi, but I guess the gist of it was that because the factories were running basically until the day of the lockdown or the day before, a lot of the migrants that work at Shahi's factories weren't able to go back home. And I think, they experienced the lockdown staying at the residential facilities or dorms where they were. And, I think a lot of credit goes to the Shahi team and the NGO, Janodia, that manages these hostels for really making sure all the workers were safe, all the migrant workers were safe and engaged. And, they did their best to ensure that it wasn't a terrible experience. But I think now there is some percentage of migrant workers who, want to go back home. And I think obviously, sometimes a crisis like this just makes you realize how important the basic things are in life, family, community. So I can totally relate to that desire. But what we're seeing is that a majority of the migrant workers are actually keen to stay on, and they're feeling the economic impacts. We've done some kind of primary research around this along with ID Insights, which we'll hopefully be sharing the data for soon. But yeah, I think like a lot of them do feel the burden, the economic burden. So at least for now, they plan on continuing to work. But yeah, I think the industry relies a lot on migrant labor. And I talked about the PPE production, the hazmat suits. In a lot of cases, it was migrant workers that were coming in to do this because they were staying in dorms or hostels that were close enough to the factory that it was safest for them to come. So I think a lot of credit goes to them, of course, and to teams that are really like innovating and really like challenging this narrative that we hear in the news about how firms are handling this migrant crisis.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and really like happy to know that migrant workers, even in a time like this, they were able to chip in and help produce important essential stuff required to fight such a pandemic. So,
Yeah.
great job, great work on both the laborers and Shahi's front. Uh, Coming back to Good Business Labs and how, so this would be a question, and in an ideal scenario, in an ideal world, what would you like to do with Good Business Labs, and what labor reforms do you think could be there through this?
Yeah. Well, I think, when we started, we knew that we had this amazing opportunity to work with the huge labor force at Shahi, all the factories, all the amazing teams that have been so supportive. So it's really allowed us to do some pretty wild type of research, randomizing all kinds of things, research that doesn't normally happen in this setting. So there's a lot of really ambitious things that we were able to do. There's still a lot more ambitious work we hope to do. I think one of our most ambitious projects is around wages. And in this industry, there's a huge conversation around the difference between what some people think workers should be earning and then minimum wage. So some people say that workers should actually be earning what's called a living wage. which in a lot of cases is almost double what the current minimum wage is. And I think, there's a lot of questions around how do you get to this number and what is the right amount that's sustainable, because obviously we all want workers to earn more and to have better, access to, money. But I think the realistic challenge is when you look at a business that has such low margins, like the garment sector, what is really sustainable? What can they do? So, this idea that we have on wages is it's to basically, it's inspired by, some of the work that Henry Ford had done back in the day when he decided to pay above market wages for his factory workers. And there was huge lines of workers outside waiting to join. I think at that time, there was no randomized control trial study with it, so we don't really know the impacts. But the idea was that it could be profitable to pay your workers more. So this is a really ambitious project within the garment sector that I think one day we hope to be able to test. But the vision has always been to take our research and take our work to other sectors, to be able to really have this evidence-based approach, and really just to change the way business is done through this approach where investing in workers isn't seen as a cost or sort of compliance or philanthropy, but it's really seen as core strategy.
Yeah. Again, really good point on how actually increasing your workers' wage would uplift their mood, motivation, and might also lead to better productivity and you getting the best out of your employees. So yeah. Again, really, really insightful point, and something that, yeah.
I say really quickly, like, it's a hypothesis that we want to test. So it's quite possible that we could run this experiment and find out that paying workers isn't more profitable. That's also a possibility. And we're not saying that firms then shouldn't pay workers. We're just saying that maybe it's, we need to find other ways to increase the wage, whether it's charge more for the clothing item and the consumer pays more. But all these questions have to be answered in order to actually solve this difficult problem. Sorry to cut you off.
Yeah. No problem. So again, I think we've had a great discussion till now. And in terms of just final parting words, any key takeaways from the talk that you would have? And this could be for people wanting to start something of their own, who are in their own jobs, looking at how certain industries might be impacted and what they can do best from the learnings of what we're doing at Good Business Labs.
Yeah. I mean, I guess if you're looking to start a business in this sector, like someone asked earlier, I should have mentioned it then, but I think there are some trends we're starting to see in terms of consumer behavior. So people aren't wearing work clothes as much. I think luxury seems like it's taken a big hit, but when you look at like more commonly worn items, those will probably be okay soon. People will start consuming them again. So that's a thought. But really, I think this whole like period of kind of like this global lockdown has provided a good opportunity to rethink a lot of things, to readjust norms. As I said, the economic, the humanitarian impacts, they're going to continue to be issues, and these need to be addressed. And I think a lot of our research, we hopefully can contribute to the knowledge around this. But the hope is that the cultural norms that come out of this, could hopefully be more positive when we think about how firms invest in their workers. A lot of the things that you saw in the photos for what Shahi's doing, where it's like really ensuring the health and well-being of their workforce through these new norms. Hopefully, these can become, the standard procedures going forward. So yeah.
Yeah. So wonderful talk, Anant, today. Really, really appreciate you taking out the time. and also the GBL team for coordinating with you, for having us, giving us the chance to get you on board, discuss the topic, and get this chance to at least put this forward to our viewership.
Yeah.
I would really like to call out certain people who helped organize this talk. Again, the Mindsperm team, Sheila, who was behind and coordinating with your team as well. So
Yeah.
there were some technical issues, and she was supposed to moderate, but she couldn't join, and we had to improvise later. But again, she did most of the she did most of the collating of the questions, getting across, and so really thankful for her as well. And again, we'd love to get more insights on what GBL is doing and share it with our base as well. So we'd keep following what you're doing, how it's affecting the labor reforms, and how actually industries are picking up on those insights. And really looking forward to having more discussions in the future. And if there are any things that we could help you with, so definitely.
Thank you.
Any parting words from your side?
No, I just want to thank you as well, and thanks to the whole Mindsperm team. I really, was looking forward to the moderation by Srila, but I really enjoyed talking to you as well, and I appreciate you stepping in. A huge shout out goes to Lavanya as well for coordinating a lot of this from our GBL team, and to the rest of the team. I really just feel like a messenger. I think a lot of the work is actually done by them, and of course, the best example of our work and knowledge put to use is what the Shahi team has been doing. So everyone from the organizational development team to HR, compliance, production, I think they really, it's really nice to see when people understand these ideas and apply them. And again, like the guidelines that we have, they're available on our site. So please feel free to check out our website and check them out. We'll hopefully share some resources with you guys so that you can send it to whoever attended. I know there was a bunch of questions on the YouTube chat that I'm seeing right now.
Yeah.
I didn't get to, but everyone should feel free to reach out. I know a lot of people here, so shout out to everyone who joined. And yeah, this was great. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Again, thank you so much, and we shall definitely be in touch with you and the team, and looking forward to working again. Yeah.
Thank you.